The dust settled on the lone figure of Rebecca Morgan as she stood at the edge of the property she had called home for 23 years. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming plains, highlighting the weathered fence posts that marked the boundaries of what was once her father's prosperous cattle ranch. The Morgan homestead had been the envy of Sweetwater County, with its sprawling pastures and sturdy buildings that had withstood both harsh winters and the even harsher realities of frontier life. But now, as Rebecca stared at the home she would never see again, all she felt was the cold sting of betrayal, cutting deeper than the autumn wind that whipped at her calico dress. Her own brother, Thomas, had sold her to settle a gambling debt, a transaction made in the shadowy back room of Hollister's saloon with a man whose name was whispered in fear across 3 territories. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled Rebecca from her thoughts. She did not turn around. She knew who it was: Jackson Blackwood, the notorious outlaw whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by his cunning ability to evade the law. The man who now, by some twisted arrangement, owned her. "Time to go, Miss Morgan," his deep voice carried across the yard, lacking the cruel edge she had expected. There was something else there, a restrained quality that surprised her. When she finally turned to face him, she saw not the monster of campfire tales, but a man whose hard eyes had seen too much of the world's brutality. Tall in his saddle, with a dark beard framing a face weathered by sun and hardship, Blackwood cut an imposing figure against the vast Wyoming sky. His gun belt sat low on his hips, worn from years of quick draws that had left men dead in the dust. "I'd rather die here than go anywhere with you," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overtake her. She had heard the stories, how Jackson Blackwood and his gang had robbed 3 banks in Colorado Territory, how they'd held up the Northern Pacific twice in a month, how men who crossed him disappeared without a trace. But Rebecca Morgan was no stranger to hardship. Orphaned of her mother at 12 and raised by a father who treated her more like a ranch hand than a daughter, she had learned to stand her ground. Even now, facing a man who could kill her without consequence, she refused to cower. "Your brother already took your money and disappeared," Blackwood replied, dismounting with a fluid grace that belied his size. "You can die here if that's your choice, but it won't change anything. Or you can come with me and maybe find a way to survive." Rebecca's hand moved to the small knife hidden in the folds of her dress, a gift from her father before consumption took him the previous winter. Thomas had waited barely 6 months before gambling away everything their father had built, including, apparently, his sister. "And what exactly would coming with you entail, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to cut. The outlaw's expression remained unreadable as he approached, stopping a respectful distance away. "For now, it means leaving this place. What happens after depends partly on you." He gestured toward a second horse, a chestnut mare with a white blaze down its face. "I didn't buy you for what you're thinking, Miss Morgan. I need someone who knows ranching, and your brother was quite eager to tell me about your skills with cattle and horses." The revelation struck Rebecca like a physical blow. Not sold as a wife or worse, but for her knowledge of ranching? It seemed too bizarre to be true. "Why would an outlaw need a rancher?" she asked, suspicion evident in her voice. Blackwood's eyes scanned the horizon, clearly uncomfortable with standing exposed for too long. "Because even outlaws need somewhere to go to ground," he answered cryptically. "You have 10 minutes to gather whatever you want to take. We've got a 3-day ride ahead of us." Rebecca stood her ground for a long moment, weighing her options. With Thomas gone and the ranch lost to his debts, she had nowhere else to go. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and as a woman alone on the frontier, her prospects were grim. At least with Blackwood, she might survive long enough to plan an escape. In the simple bedroom that had been hers since childhood, Rebecca quickly gathered her few possessions: a change of clothes, her mother's tarnished silver hairbrush, the small Bible that had been her companion through many lonely nights. She hesitated at the drawer where she kept her father's old Navy Colt revolver, wondering if Blackwood had allowed her this privacy as a test. Taking the gun might mean her immediate death if he searched her belongings. Leaving it might mean missing her only chance for protection. With a deep breath, she made her decision, wrapping the revolver in a shawl and placing it in her satchel. Whatever awaited her with the notorious outlaw, Rebecca Morgan would not go entirely defenseless into her uncertain future. Hey friends, if you're enjoying this story so far, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. I'm curious, what city are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below. The journey north was grueling, taking them through rugged country rarely traversed even by the most hardened frontiersmen. Blackwood proved to be a man of few words, speaking only when necessary, usually to give instructions or warnings about the trail ahead. They rode from dawn until dusk, making camp in sheltered locations always chosen with a tactical eye, places with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. Rebecca watched and learned, noting how the outlaw constantly scanned their surroundings, how he checked and rechecked his weapons, how he seemed to sleep with one eye open. This was a man hunted, a man who expected danger around every bend. Yet he treated her with a detached courtesy that confused her. He shared his provisions evenly, allowed her privacy when possible, and never made any inappropriate advances. On the third evening, as they made camp in a sheltered canyon with high walls of red rock, Rebecca finally broke the tense silence that had stretched between them. "You still haven't told me where we're going," she said as she built a small fire with the sparse kindling they had gathered. Blackwood, busying himself with the horses, paused momentarily. "It's better you don't know until we arrive," he replied, his voice carrying in the still air. "Safer for both of us." Rebecca stoked the small flames, frustration evident in her movements. "I'm not sure 'safe' is the right word for traveling with a man wanted in 3 territories," she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "I have a right to know what future I've been sold into." Something flickered across Blackwood's face, perhaps surprise at her boldness, or something closer to respect. He secured the horses and approached the fire, removing his hat as he sat across from her. The flames cast dramatic shadows across his features, softening the hard lines etched by years of living outside the law. "I own land," he said finally, his voice low enough that she had to lean forward to hear him. "A ranch in a remote valley up in the Bighorn Mountains. No one knows about it. Not the law, not the other members of my gang. No one." He met her gaze directly, for perhaps the first time since they'd left her family home. "I need someone who can help make it profitable while I'm away on business. Someone who won't attract attention, who knows cattle and horses better than most men in the territory." Rebecca studied him across the dancing flames, trying to reconcile this revelation with the bloodthirsty outlaw of legend. "You're planning to retire from robbing and killing?" she asked skeptically. A humorless smile briefly touched Blackwood's lips. "Eventually, every outlaw either dies or disappears. I'd prefer the latter," He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "But a man needs something to disappear to, Miss Morgan, and building a legitimate business takes time and knowledge I don't possess." The implication was clear. He needed her skills to create his escape from the life he'd built for himself. It was both calculating and, in an odd way, almost honorable. He wasn't looking for a wife or a companion. He wanted a business partner who could create something lasting while he continued his outlaw ways. Dawn broke over the mountain peaks, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber as they crested a ridge to reveal a sight that momentarily took Rebecca's breath away. Below them stretched a verdant valley, sheltered on three sides by towering mountains and bisected by a clear, rushing stream that meandered through meadows lush with grass. At the far end stood a cabin, not the rough shelter she had expected, but a solidly built structure of logs, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Nearby was a barn and corral, and beyond that, the beginning of a split-rail fence marking pasture land. "Welcome to Blackwood Ranch," Jackson said, a note of pride evident in his usually guarded voice. For a moment, Rebecca forgot her circumstances as she took in the pristine beauty of the hidden valley. This was good land, the kind that men fought and died for across the West. As they descended the steep trail into the valley, Rebecca's mind raced with questions. How had a notorious outlaw managed to establish this place without anyone knowing? How long had he been planning this secret refuge? And more importantly, what role did he truly intend for her to play here? The questions remained unspoken as they approached the cabin, where Blackwood dismounted with his customary fluid grace and gestured for her to do the same. "There's no one else here," he said, correctly interpreting her cautious glances around the property. "Just us." That statement, intended to be reassuring, only heightened Rebecca's wariness. Alone in this remote valley with a known killer, she was more at his mercy than ever. Her hand instinctively moved to where her father's knife was hidden in her boot, a movement not missed by this hidden valley, beautiful as it was, would be her prison. Perhaps gilded, but a prison nonetheless. Yet as her gaze swept over the untamed meadows and the half-built structures of a ranch in its infancy, she felt something unexpected stir within her. Here was possibility, raw and untamed as the land itself. If she truly was to be the architect of Blackwood's legitimate future, perhaps she could build something for herself as well. The days that followed settled into an unexpected routine. Blackwood showed her every aspect of the property: the small herd of cattle grazing in the high meadow, the 4 horses in the corral besides their own mounts, the vegetable garden behind the cabin that had clearly been tended with care. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly comfortable, with a main room centered around a large stone fireplace, a well-equipped kitchen, and 3 bedrooms. Rebecca chose the smallest, furthest from Blackwood's own quarters, establishing whatever boundaries she could in this strange arrangement. The outlaw himself remained an enigma, courteous but distant, sharing meals with her but revealing little about himself beyond what was necessary for her to understand the ranch operations. He spent hours in what appeared to be a study, door closed, emerging with plans and lists of supplies they would need. On the evening before his scheduled departure, as they sat across from each other at the rough-hewn table, sharing a simple meal of venison stew, Blackwood finally addressed the questions that had hung unspoken between them. "I'll be gone for about a month," he said, placing a heavy leather pouch on the table between them. The distinct clink of coins revealed its contents. This should be more than enough for any supplies you need. There's a trading post about half a day's ride east. Man named Holloway runs it. He doesn't ask questions." He paused, studying her reaction before continuing. "You could run, of course. Take a horse, the money, and disappear. But the nearest town is 3 days, hard riding through mountain passes that would challenge even experienced guides. And if you made it, what then? A woman alone has few options in the territories, none of them pleasant." Rebecca met his gaze steadily, refusing to show the intimidation she felt. "So I'm still a prisoner, just with a larger cage." Blackwood's expression remained unreadable as he pushed away his empty bowl. "Think of it as a business arrangement, Miss Morgan. You help build this place into a working ranch, and in return, you get a roof over your head, food, protection, and a share of whatever profits come." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "And when the time comes that I need to disappear from my current life completely, you'll have earned your freedom and a choice about what comes next." It was more than she had expected, yet still fundamentally coercive. Her skills in labor in exchange for eventual freedom, freedom that should have been hers by right. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Blackwood stood, gathering their dishes with a domesticity that seemed incongruous with his fearsome reputation. "Then I find someone else," he said simply. "Someone who might not treat this place or you with the care I hope you will." The implied threat hung in the air between them, all the more effective for its subtlety. Rebecca remained seated, her mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to the same conclusion. For now, at least, cooperation was her only viable path. "I'll need more hands if you truly want this to be a working ranch," she said finally, her decision made. "No one builds a successful operation alone." A ghost of a smile touched Blackwood's lips. "I'll consider it. For now, do what you can. I've arranged for monthly supply deliveries whether I'm here or not." True to his word, Blackwood departed before dawn the next morning. Rebecca watched from the cabin porch as he rode up the steep trail out of the valley, his figure gradually becoming smaller against the vast landscape until he disappeared entirely over the ridge. Only then did she allow herself to explore the property thoroughly, searching for weaknesses in her confinement and taking true stock of what she had to work with. The cabin revealed few personal details about its owner, no photographs, letters, or keepsakes. The study, now unlocked in his absence, contained maps, ledgers filled with neat figures, and a small library of books ranging from practical guides to ranching and animal husbandry to volumes of poetry and philosophy that suggested depths to Jackson Blackwood that contradicted his bloody legend. The weeks of solitude that followed became a test of Rebecca's resilience and ingenuity. She established a rigorous routine, rising with the sun to tend the animals, expanding the vegetable garden, and making careful inventory of supplies. She explored the valley's boundaries, confirming Blackwood's claim about its isolation. Steep cliffs and treacherous passes surrounded them on all sides, with only the one trail offering a viable route in or out. At night, she read by lamplight from Blackwood's unexpected library, searching both for knowledge that might aid her in managing the ranch and for insights into the complex man who had brought her there. Occasionally, she would take out her father's revolver, cleaning and loading it with the ammunition she had found in a kitchen cupboard, then hiding it again beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. Whether it would ever be used against Blackwood or to defend the property they now shared, even she couldn't say. exactly 1 month after his departure. As Rebecca was mending a section of fence in the far meadow, she heard the distinctive sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders, not just one. Her heart hammered in her chest as she quickly gathered her tools and retreated toward the cabin, her hand moving instinctively to the knife in her boot. From the cover of the barn, she watched as 4 riders emerged from the trail, Blackwood in the lead, followed by 3 men she didn't recognize. Relief at seeing him return safely was quickly replaced by wariness at the presence of strangers. As they dismounted in the yard, Rebecca emerged cautiously, clutching a pitchfork with white-knuckled determination. Blackwood spotted her immediately, a flicker of what might have been approval crossing his face at her prudent caution. "Miss Morgan," he called, approaching her while the other men tended to the horses. "I'd like you to meet our new ranch hands." The introduction was casual, as though bringing outlaws to their hidden valley was an everyday occurrence. The men he presented were a study in contrasts. A weathered older man with a silver-streaked beard, introduced as Caleb Wheeler, a former cavalry scout who needed to disappear for a while. A burly, taciturn man called only Dutch, whose massive hands looked capable of bending iron. And a younger man named Daniel Cooper, barely out of his teens, with intelligent eyes that darted nervously around the property. "They're all men who owe me," Blackwood explained later, as they stood alone on the cabin porch, watching the newcomers establish themselves in the bunkhouse, adjacent to the barn. "And all have skills we need to build this place properly." That night, as the autumn wind howled down from the mountain peaks, bringing the first hint of winter's approach, Rebecca lay awake in her bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of other people on the property. Blackwood had returned with not only men, but supplies, lumber, tools, seed, and even a small herd of additional cattle being driven up by another associate due to arrive within days. It was clear that his business trip had been lucrative and that he was accelerating his plans for the ranch. What remained unclear was whether this development improved her position or complicated it further. More people meant more witnesses to her presence, more potential allies, or more obstacles to any future escape. As sleep finally claimed her, Rebecca's last conscious thought was that the isolated valley that had been her prison was rapidly transforming into something else entirely. A community of outcasts, with her and Jackson Blackwood at its center. The arrival of winter transformed the valley into a world of crystalline beauty, with snow blanketing the meadows and ice fringing the stream that ran through the property. It also effectively sealed them off from the outside world, the mountain passes becoming impassable until spring thaw. During these months of enforced isolation, the small community at Blackwood Ranch developed its own rhythms and hierarchies. Caleb, with his decades of frontier experience, became an invaluable mentor to Rebecca in the finer points of animal husbandry and predicting mountain weather. Dutch's taciturn nature concealed exceptional skills as a blacksmith and carpenter, his massive hands surprisingly delicate when crafting the tools and furnishings the growing ranch required. Young Daniel, initially the most reserved of the group, revealed himself to be educated and quick-witted, taking on the role of record keeper for the ranch operations. Blackwood himself settled into a strange dual existence, present at the ranch for weeks at a time, then disappearing for similar stretches, always returning with more supplies, occasionally more livestock, and once a wagon loaded with lumber that would become a new wing of the main cabin. The pattern of his comings and goings remained mysterious to Rebecca, though she caught snippets of conversations that suggested his outlaw activities continued unabated. Newspapers brought by the monthly supply rider carried stories of bank robberies and train heists attributed to the notorious Blackwood Gang, with bounties on their leader's head growing with each successful crime. These reports created a cognitive dissonance for Rebecca, who found it increasingly difficult to reconcile the bloodthirsty criminal of the wanted posters with the man who sat by the fire in the evenings, teaching Daniel to read better or discussing cattle bloodlines with her in the thoughtful, articulate manner of an educated rancher. As winter deepened, turning the days shorter and the nights bitterly cold, the boundaries between captor and captive, employer and employee, began to blur in ways that left Rebecca unsettled. She found herself watching for Blackwood's return when he was away, noting with dismay how her heart would lift at the sight of his tall figure cresting the ridge above the valley. During his absences, she took her meals with the other men in the bunkhouse, maintaining her authority as the ranch manager while sharing in their camaraderie. But when Blackwood was present, she joined him in the main cabin, their dinners evolving from silent, awkward affairs into lengthy conversations that ranged from practical ranch matters to debates about the books they had both read, revealing a meeting of minds that she had never expected to find with the man who had purchased her from her treacherous brother. On a particularly brutal January night, with the wind howling like a living thing against the cabin walls and the temperature falling to dangerous lows, Rebecca was awakened by the sound of the front door slamming open. She reached instinctively for her father's revolver, now kept beneath her pillow, before recognizing Blackwood's voice calling her name with an urgency she had never heard before. Wrapping herself in a heavy woolen shawl, she emerged from her room to find him standing in the main room, snow melting from his coat and hat, supporting a half-conscious Caleb whose face was alarmingly pale beneath his weathered tan. "Frostbite," Blackwood explained tersely, as they helped the older man to the bearskin rug before the roaring fire. "Found him trying to make it back from checking the north fence line. Must have gotten disoriented in the blizzard." For the next 3 hours, Rebecca worked alongside Blackwood to save Caleb's life and limbs, using every frontier remedy she had learned from her father and the old ranch hands on the Morgan property. They bathed the affected extremities in cool water, gradually warming them as circulation painfully returned. They administered whiskey for the pain and wrapped the old scout in every blanket they could find. Throughout the ordeal, Rebecca was struck by Blackwood's gentle competence, the way his usually commanding presence softened into something almost tender as he tended to his injured man. When Caleb finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, his condition stable, if not entirely certain, Rebecca and Jackson found themselves alone by the fire, physically and emotionally drained by their shared battle against death's encroachment. "Why do you care so much?" Rebecca asked softly, the question that had been building for months finally finding voice in the intimate quiet of the firelit room. "About this place, about these men, about any of it." Blackwood stared into the flames for a long moment before answering, his profile sharp against the dancing light. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," he said finally, his voice rough with fatigue and emotion. "Even men like me, even men like them." He turned to look at her directly, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. "Even women who've been wronged by those who should have protected them. The simple statement contained multitudes: acknowledgement of her victimization, recognition of her strength, and something more personal that neither of them seemed ready to name. Spring came late to the high country, but when it arrived, it transformed the valley with explosive verdancy. Meadows carpeted with wildflowers, aspen groves unfurling tender green leaves, the streams swollen with snowmelt rushing down from the peaks. With the changing season came changes to Blackwood Ranch as well. The cattle herd had nearly doubled through winter births and Blackwood's mysterious acquisitions. The main cabin had been expanded to include a proper dining room large enough for all of them to share meals together. A smokehouse and root cellar had been added to preserve the bounty of hunting and gardening. Most significantly, what had begun as Rebecca's captivity had evolved into leadership, with even Blackwood deferring to her judgment on matters of ranch operations. On a warm May afternoon, as Rebecca supervised Dutch and Daniel in the construction of an irrigation system for the expanded vegetable gardens, a rider appeared on the ridge above the valley, a solitary figure silhouetted against the clear blue sky. Even at a distance, she recognized Blackwood's distinctive posture in the saddle, but something about his approach seemed wrong. His usually straight-backed confidence was absent, his horse moving at an uncharacteristically slow pace down the steep trail. "Something's wrong," she said sharply to the men, abandoning the irrigation project and striding toward the main yard. By the time Blackwood reached level ground, all 4 of the ranch's permanent residents had gathered to meet him. The reason for his unusual approach became immediately apparent. A bloodstain had spread across his left side, darkening his shirt and the saddle beneath him. "Marshall's posse," he explained tersely as they helped him from his horse, his face gray with pain and blood loss. "Ambush at Thompson's Crossing. Got a bullet in my side, but I lost them in the high passes." Rebecca's medical knowledge, honed through a lifetime on isolated ranches and refined during the winter's various injuries and illnesses, took over as they carried him into the cabin. The bullet had passed clean through, missing vital organs but leaving behind significant damage and blood loss. As she worked to clean and stitch the wounds, front and back, she maintained a running commentary of practical matters: the state of the ranch, the progress of the irrigation system, the health of the new calves, anything to keep him conscious and focused on her voice rather than the pain of her ministrations. Later, as Blackwood slept the deep sleep of exhaustion and trauma, Rebecca sat beside his bed, studying the face she had come to know so well over the past months. Relaxed in sleep, the hard lines of vigilance and authority softened, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been had life taken different turns. On the bedside table lay the contents of his pockets, emptied when they'd cut away his blood-soaked clothing, among them a folded document that had caught Rebecca's eye. Now, certain that he wouldn't wake, she carefully unfolded the paper to reveal a deed, a legal transfer of the ranch property to Rebecca Morgan and Associates, dated 3 weeks earlier and signed before a territorial judge in a town she'd never heard of. The implications staggered her. Blackwood had legally given her the ranch, protecting it from seizure should he be captured or killed, ensuring that what they had built together would survive regardless of his fate. The discovery of the deed marked a turning point, though Rebecca kept its existence to herself, refolding the document and returning it exactly as she had found it. If Blackwood wanted her to know about this significant act, he would tell her in his own time. Meanwhile, his recovery progressed with agonizing slowness. The usually active man confined to bed and then to limited movement around the cabin. During this period of enforced proximity, the relationship between them underwent its most profound evolution yet. As Rebecca tended his wounds and they passed long hours in conversation, the last barriers of formality fell away. She learned of his childhood in Missouri, the violent death of his parents during border skirmishes, his first crimes committed out of desperate hunger, and the gradual hardening of his reputation as a means of survival in a world that offered few options to orphaned boys. In turn, Rebecca shared her own history, the death of her mother, her father's emotional withdrawal, the burden of running a ranch while still a child herself, and finally, the bitter betrayal by her brother that had placed her in Blackwood's hands. "He thought he was selling me to a monster," she concluded one evening as they sat on the cabin porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson. Jackson's laugh held no humor. "He wasn't entirely wrong," he replied, his hand unconsciously moving to his still healing side. "The stories they tell about me, most of them are true." Rebecca turned to study his profile, finding herself unafraid of this admission. "The man in those stories wouldn't have built this place," she said quietly. "Wouldn't have given second chances to broken men like Caleb and Dutch and Daniel. Wouldn't have saved my life by giving me a purpose again." By midsummer, with Blackwood fully recovered and the ranch operations thriving under Rebecca's management, the outside world intruded on their mountain sanctuary once more. The monthly supply rider brought newspapers with troubling news. A major manhunt was underway for the Blackwood gang, with federal marshals joining territorial authorities in the most extensive pursuit the region had seen. More disturbing were the reports that a former associate had turned informant, providing details about Blackwood's operations and known hideouts. Though their valley remained secret, the noose was clearly tightening. That evening, after the others had retired to the bunkhouse, Jackson and Rebecca sat at the kitchen table, maps spread between them, as they discussed options that neither had ever expected to consider. "You could leave," Rebecca suggested, her finger tracing potential escape routes south to Colorado, west to Idaho territory. "Start fresh, somewhere no one knows your name." Blackwood's expression was grim as he shook his head. "They'd never stop looking, and even if I disappeared, they'd eventually find this place, find all of you. You'd be charged as accomplices." He ran a hand through his dark hair, now threaded with silver at the temples that hadn't been there when they first met. "There's only one way this ends, where you all stay safe and free." Rebecca felt cold dread settle in her stomach at his words, at the resigned finality in his voice. "You can't be thinking of surrendering," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The half-smile he gave her was both tender and heartbreaking. "Not surrender. Negotiation. On my terms, not theirs." The plan that Blackwood outlined was both brilliant and terrible. He would use his connections to arrange a meeting with the territorial governor, offering to turn himself in and provide information about other outlaws in exchange for full pardons for his ranch employees, who would be characterized as innocent workers, unaware of their employer's criminal activities. The ranch itself, already deeded to Rebecca, would remain hers, untouchable by authorities seeking to claim Blackwood's assets. "You'll all be safe," he concluded, his hand covering hers on the rough wooden table. "You'll have the ranch, legitimate ownership, a fresh start." Rebecca stared at their joined hands, emotions warring within her. Gratitude for his sacrifice, rage at the injustice that demanded it, and beneath it all, a devastating realization of what she truly felt for this complex man who had first been her captor and now was prepared to surrender his freedom to protect her. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice thick with unshed tears. "What happens to Jackson Blackwood?" He withdrew his hand, straightening in his chair with a return of the rigid posture she had come to associate with his outlaw persona, rather than the man she had come to know in their shared valley. "Best case, 20 years in territorial prison. Worst case, they hang me." He stated it clinically, as though discussing the weather rather than his own probable death. "But I've made my peace with that. This place, what we've built here, it's worth it." Rebecca stood abruptly, knocking over her chair in her vehemence. "No," she declared, surprising them both with her ferocity. "I won't accept that. We'll find another way." Blackwood rose more slowly, coming around the table to stand before her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "There is no other way, Rebecca," he said softly, using her given name for perhaps the first time. "But before I go, there's something I need to know." The question hung unspoken between them, filling the space with tension and possibility. Rebecca looked up into the face of the man who had changed her life in ways neither could have predicted, finding in his eyes not the cold calculation of their first meeting, but something vulnerable and questioning. Later, she would never be sure who moved first, only that suddenly his arms were around her, and her hands were tangled in his hair, as their lips met in a kiss that contained all the confusion, fear, respect, and unexpected love that had grown between captive and captor, outlaw and rancher, man and woman. When they finally broke apart, breathless and shaken by the intensity of what had passed between them, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "Don't deserve you." Rebecca closed her eyes, allowing herself to savor the moment before the harsh reality of their situation reasserted itself. "None of us get what we deserve in this life," she replied. "Only what we fight for." Dawn found them still at the kitchen table, the remnants of maps and plans scattered across its surface, replaced by a new and desperate strategy. Rebecca had refused to accept Jackson's sacrifice, insisting that there must be a third path between surrender and endless flight. Together, they had constructed an audacious alternative, one that required perfect timing, absolute trust, and no small amount of luck. It would begin with the same meeting with the territorial governor that Blackwood had proposed, but rather than surrendering himself, he would offer something potentially more valuable to a politician with ambitions beyond the territories: the complete dismantling of the 3 largest outlaw gangs operating in the region, including his own. In exchange, he would demand not only pardons for his ranch employees, but for himself as well, along with a new identity that would allow him to disappear legitimately. "It's a long shot," Jackson admitted, as they watched the sun rise over the eastern ridge, painting the valley in the golden light that never failed to take Rebecca's breath away. "The governor might just have me arrested on the spot." Rebecca's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity that had developed between them. "Then I'll be there as your witness," she said firmly, the respectable ranch owner vouching for the reformed outlaw who saved her from destitution. Blackwood's laugh held genuine amusement. "That's stretching the truth considerably, given that I bought you like cattle." Rebecca's answering smile held both irony and affection. "The West was built on reinvention, Mr. Blackwood. We're just following tradition." The weeks that followed were filled with careful preparation and growing tension. Messages were dispatched through trusted intermediaries, arrangements made for the crucial meeting in the territorial capital. The other men of the ranch were informed of the plan on a need-to-know basis, each reacting in character. Caleb with weathered pragmatism, Dutch with stoic acceptance, and young Daniel with nervous energy channeled into obsessive attention to maintaining the ranch operations during their absence. Through it all, Rebecca and Jackson moved in a strange limbo, their newly acknowledged feelings for each other tempered by the knowledge that their future together hung by the slenderest of threads. They did not speak of what would happen if the plan failed, if they were separated by prison walls, or worse. Instead, they poured their energy into preparing for success, into believing that the life they had glimpsed could become reality. On the morning of their departure, as they prepared to ride out of the valley together for the first time since her arrival nearly a year before, Rebecca paused on the cabin porch, taking in the view that had transformed from her prison to her home. The ranch had flourished under their joint care, fields planted with wheat and corn, orchards beginning to take root on the southern slopes, the cattle herd growing fat on the rich valley grass. More than the physical prosperity, though, she valued the community they had built. Caleb showing Daniel how to track deer through the forest, Dutch crafting furniture for the expanded cabin, all of them gathering for meals where the conversation flowed as freely as the coffee. This was what they were fighting to preserve, not just land and buildings, but the second chances that Jackson Blackwood had offered to everyone who crossed his path, including the woman who had once despised him. The journey to the territorial capital took 5 days, during which Rebecca and Jackson traveled as Mr. and Mrs. James Morgan, respectable ranchers seeking an audience with the governor regarding land rights. The false identity was one of many Blackwood had maintained over the years, complete with documentation that passed casual scrutiny. As they rode side by side through mountain passes and across open prairie, Rebecca found herself studying the man beside her, not the notorious outlaw or the ranch owner, but the complex individual who somehow encompassed both. She saw how he modulated his behavior as they approached civilization, softening his vigilant posture, adopting the slightly deferential manner of a successful but humble businessman. She noted how he never fully relaxed, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, his hand never far from his concealed weapon. And she realized with startling clarity that she had come to love not just parts of him, but the whole, the darkness and the light, the violence and the tenderness, the outlaw and the man who dreamed of redemption. The territorial capital proved to be little more than an oversized frontier town with pretensions to grandeur, a main street lined with brick buildings instead of wooden storefronts, a courthouse of modest but imposing design, and the governor's mansion set on a small rise overlooking what passed for urban civilization in the territories. As they checked into the town's best hotel under their assumed names, Rebecca felt the weight of what they were attempting settle on her shoulders. Tomorrow, they would walk into the governor's office and place their fate in the hands of a politician, known more for ambition than mercy. Tonight would be their last night of freedom together if things went wrong. As the hotel door closed behind them, Rebecca turned to Jackson, with determination replacing her momentary doubt. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, "know that I choose this, choose you, of my own free will. Not because you bought me, not because you saved me, but because of who we've become together." The grandfather clock in the governor's outer office ticked with ponderous solemnity as Rebecca and Jackson waited for their appointment, each passing minute stretching their nerves tighter. They sat side by side on an uncomfortable settee, dressed in their finest clothes. She in a blue dress purchased specifically for this occasion. He in a black suit that transformed him from rugged frontiersman to respectable businessman. Between them on the settee lay a leather portfolio containing documents that would either secure their future or condemn them. Maps showing the locations of outlaw hideouts, names of gang members and their crimes, detailed accounts of operations that only an insider could know, and most crucially, evidence of corruption among several territorial officials who had been paid to look the other way. It was a treasure trove of information for an ambitious politician looking to make his mark, and a death sentence for the man providing it if word leaked to those implicated. When they were finally ushered into the governor's presence, Rebecca was struck by how ordinary the man appeared behind his imposing desk. Middle-aged, slightly portly, with the florid complexion of someone who enjoyed his whiskey and rich food. Governor Arthur Harrison welcomed them with practiced political warmth, gesturing them to chairs before inquiring about their business. It was the moment of truth, the point at which their carefully constructed plan would either take flight or crash before it began. Jackson cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Governor Harrison, I'm not who my papers claim I am," he began, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was doing. "My real name is Jackson Blackwood, and I believe I have something of considerable value to offer you." The next 2 hours were among the most tense of Rebecca's life, as Jackson methodically presented their proposal, revealing enough of the portfolio's contents to demonstrate its value, while withholding critical details as leverage. The governor's reactions progressed from shock to disbelief to calculating interest as the potential political capital of such information became clear. Questions were asked and answered, terms proposed and negotiated, with Rebecca contributing her perspective as the legitimate owner of Blackwood Ranch, emphasizing the reformed nature of all its inhabitants and their contribution to territorial development. Throughout the delicate dance of negotiation, she watched Jackson with quiet pride. His intelligence and strategic mind, so long directed toward criminal enterprises, now focused on securing a future neither of them had dared to imagine a year before. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the governor's office, a tentative agreement emerged from the tense discussions. In exchange for Blackwood's complete cooperation in dismantling the outlaw networks that plagued the territories, including testimony if necessary, Governor Harrison would grant conditional pardons to Blackwood and his associates to become permanent upon successful prosecution of the major gang leaders and corrupt officials identified in the portfolio. Additionally, new identities would be provided for Blackwood and anyone else requiring them, allowing for their legal disappearance once their usefulness had ended. It was more than they had dared hope for, yet Rebecca felt no triumph as they stood to shake the governor's hand, only cautious relief and the knowledge that they had traded one form of danger for another. For the next several months, Jackson Blackwood would become the most hunted man in the territories, not just by the law, but by every outlaw and corrupt official he had agreed to betray. The return journey to Blackwood Ranch was conducted with heightened vigilance, their path deliberately circuitous to avoid potential ambush. They spoke little during the long days of riding, each absorbed in thoughts of what lay ahead. The agreement with the governor required Jackson to be absent from the ranch for extended periods, meeting with lawmen in secret locations, identifying gang members from wanted posters, even occasionally accompanying posses to point out hidden trails and camps known only to insiders. During these absences, Rebecca would maintain the ranch operations, providing both practical cover for his activities and a legitimate future to return to when it was all over. The danger would be immense for both of them. Direct physical threat for him, and the constant fear of retribution for her should his role become known to those he was helping to capture. As they crested the final ridge before their hidden valley came into view, they reined in their horses by mutual accord, taking a moment to absorb the sight of what they had built together, what they were risking everything to preserve. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the meadows where cattle grazed peacefully, glinted off the stream that wound through the heart of their land, and burnished the logs of the cabin they had gradually transformed into a home. "It's worth it," Rebecca said softly, answering the unspoken question that hung between them. "Whatever comes next, this," she gestured at the valley below, but her eyes remained fixed on the man beside her, "is worth fighting for." Jackson's hand reached across the space between their horses to grasp hers, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Yes," he agreed simply, "it is." The months that followed unfolded like a high-stakes game of chess, with moves and counter-moves, calculated risks and narrow escapes. Jackson was absent more often than present, returning to the ranch for brief periods of recuperation between his clandestine activities. Each time he rode into the valley, Rebecca would count new gray hairs in his beard, new lines of exhaustion around his eyes, occasionally new scars from close calls he was reluctant to describe. Yet with each return, there was also progress to report. Gang members captured, corrupt officials exposed, the network of lawlessness that had defined his former life gradually dismantled, piece by piece. The price was high, paid in constant vigilance and the growing isolation of their mountain sanctuary, as they minimized contact with the outside world to reduce the risk of discovery. Winter came again to the high country, sealing the mountain passes and providing a natural protection that allowed for something approaching normalcy at the ranch. With Jackson present for the longest continuous stretch since their agreement with the governor, he and Rebecca settled into the domestic rhythm they had glimpsed but never fully experienced. They shared meals with the other men in the expanded dining room, planned spring planting, repaired equipment in preparation for the coming year, and in the private sanctuary of the master bedroom they now shared, dared to speak of a future beyond the dangerous game they were playing. It was during one such intimate conversation, as snow fell gently beyond the window and firelight cast dancing shadows across the log walls, that Jackson finally asked the question that had hovered unspoken between them for months. "When this is over," he said, his voice hushed in the quiet room, his hand tracing patterns on Rebecca's bare shoulder as she lay beside him. "When I'm no longer Jackson Blackwood, will you marry me? Properly, legally, under whatever name I'm given." The question, so conventional in its nature, seemed almost absurd given the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. Purchased bride and outlaw captor, transformed through shared purpose and growing love into partners in every sense. Rebecca propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face in the flickering light. "I thought I already was your wife," she replied with gentle irony. "At least according to what you told the governor." Jackson's answering smile held both humor and vulnerability. "I'd like it to be true," he said simply. "Not just a convenient story for politicians and lawmen, but real." Rebecca leaned down to kiss him, her answer clear in the gesture that sealed their private commitment to a shared future, whatever name it might carry. Spring brought renewal to the land and accelerated activity in Jackson's dangerous work with the territorial authorities. With the mountain passes clear, he was absent more frequently and for longer periods. The end of their ordeal tantalizingly close, yet still beyond reach. The governor's promised pardons required one final crucial achievement: the capture of Eli Stanton, the ruthless leader of the largest remaining outlaw gang in the territories, and Jackson's former rival in the criminal hierarchy. Stanton was notoriously elusive, protected by a network of loyal gang members and informants within the local law enforcement. Bringing him to justice would require not just information, but direct involvement, a fact that filled Rebecca with cold dread when Jackson explained the plan during a brief return to the ranch in late April. "It's too dangerous," she argued, as they stood on the cabin porch, the valley around them lush with spring growth that seemed to mock the darkness of their conversation. "Stanton knows you're working with the authorities by now. He'll be expecting something like this." Jackson's expression was grim but determined as he looked out over the land they had cultivated together. "It's the only way to end this," he replied. "One last job, one last risk, and then we're free, all of us." He turned to her, taking her hands in his with uncharacteristic urgency. "I need you to be ready. If this works, I'll be back within 2 weeks with the final papers from the governor. New identities for me and the men. Legal recognition of our marriage. Everything we've worked for. If it doesn't," he hesitated, the possibility too painful to articulate fully. "If I'm not back in 2 weeks, take the men and the deed to the ranch and go to Governor Harrison. He'll honor our agreement for your sake, even if I'm not there to see it through." The parting that followed was the most difficult they had endured, each acutely aware of the Houghton stakes and the very real possibility that they might not see each other again. As Jackson prepared to ride out of the valley, Rebecca pressed into his hand a small object that glinted in the morning sun, her mother's wedding ring, worn on a chain around her neck since childhood, now offered as both talisman and promise. "Come back to me," she said simply, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "Come back to us." Jackson closed his fist around the ring, bringing it briefly to his lips before slipping the chain over his head, the small gold band disappearing beneath his shirt to rest against his heart. With a final look at the woman who had transformed from his captive to his salvation, he turned his horse toward the mountain pass and the dangerous mission that awaited beyond. The promised 2 weeks stretched into an agonizing 18 days, each passing hour increasing the dread that settled like a physical weight on Rebecca's shoulders. Spring planting continued. Cattle were moved to higher pastures. The routine of ranch life proceeded with mechanical precision as she drove herself and the men to exhaustion each day in an attempt to outrun her fears. On the 19th day, as Rebecca stood in the vegetable garden, she had expanded each year of her captivity-turned residence. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the ridge above the valley. Her heart leapt at the sight of multiple riders, then faltered as she realized the lead figure was not the familiar silhouette she had prayed to see. Instead, a uniformed man led a small group down the trail into their sanctuary, the glint of sun on metal revealing the territorial marshal's badge on his chest. With soil-stained hands and terror in her heart, Rebecca walked toward the approaching riders, gathering her composure with each step. By the time they reached the main yard, she had transformed from anxious lover to confident ranch owner, greeting the marshal with a calm dignity that belied the turmoil within. "Mrs. Blackwood," the marshal said, removing his hat as he dismounted, a gesture of respect that momentarily confused her. "I'm Marshal James Sullivan. I believe we have some papers for you, and some news you've been waiting for." It was only then that Rebecca noticed one of the riders remaining slightly behind the others, his hat pulled low over his face in the manner of someone unaccustomed to direct sunlight. As the figure dismounted and stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal a gaunt face with familiar dark eyes, Rebecca felt the world tilt beneath her feet. It was Jackson, thinner, paler, with a new scar along his jawline, but undeniably alive and standing before her with a leather portfolio clutched in his hand. "It's done," he said simply, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "Stanton's in custody, along with the last of his gang. The governor has honored his word." He held out the portfolio, which Rebecca took with hands that trembled despite her best efforts at composure. Inside were the documents they had risked everything for: official pardons for Jackson Blackwood and his associates, legal recognition of their ownership of the ranch, and most significantly, new identity papers for Jackson Davis, respectable rancher and husband to Rebecca Davis, née Morgan. The name change was minor, preserving his initials while shedding the notorious surname that had been both shield and prison. More important was what it represented: a legal death for the outlaw Jackson Blackwood, and a legitimate birth for the man who would build a future in the hidden valley they had claimed together. That evening, as the sun set on a day that marked the true beginning of their life together, Rebecca and Jackson stood on the ridge above their valley, watching as golden light transformed their home into a painting of impossible beauty. The marshal and his men had departed after sharing a celebratory meal, leaving behind not just the crucial documents, but a wedding gift of sorts: official recognition of their marriage, performed on the spot by the marshal, who, it turned out, was also authorized to conduct such ceremonies. The simple exchange of vows, witnessed by the men who had become their family, and sealed with the gold ring that had journeyed with Jackson through his final dangerous mission, had transformed their private commitment into public acknowledgement. Now, as they stood hand in hand overlooking all they had built, the journey from captivity to freedom, from ownership to partnership, from outlaw and prisoner to husband and wife, seemed both impossible and inevitable. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked softly, the question encompassing not just their immediate future, but the larger implications of their transformed lives. Jackson's hand tightened around hers as he gazed out over the valley that had become their shared dream. "Now we live," he replied simply. "We build something that outlasts us, something good to balance the scales of what came before." The answer contained both acceptance of his past and commitment to a different future. Not erasing the outlaw who had once been feared across 3 territories, but channeling that strength and determination into creating rather than taking, building rather than destroying. As darkness began to claim the valley and the first stars appeared in the eastern sky, Rebecca and Jackson turned back toward the lights of their cabin, walking side by side down the trail that led home. Behind them, the shadows of their former selves, the betrayed sister and the notorious outlaw, gradually faded into the gathering night, leaving only the rancher and his wife to continue the story they had begun writing together. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.